Okay, the floor's open for discussion for roughly half an hour. Any questions or comments? Akbar, you look like you're ready to pounce. Well, why don't you kick off?
I'd like to kick off with a comment on Vyjayanthi and Jane, so this might relate also to Brian's and Vicky's presentation. It seems to me that in the broadest sense, what the both of you are talking about is information. Information, technologies for technologies of information. And the dilemmas this poses both to design education and to theoretical and political practice. Because, I mean, if we begin with Jane, I was picking out some phrases that you were using, like how we are going beyond representation, how the scale of information now is so huge, and so on and so forth. And one of the things that information does is that it would really, and this has been something that has been circulating around this seminar, it would make us really have to ask the question, what is a thing now? What is an object? And one of things, and one way of entering into that, towards an answer to that question is that it seems that one of the things about information is that in one sense, information is invisible. I mean, it's not subject to spectacles. I'm not saying that it's absolutely invisible, but it's like what you have here is that with information, visibility becomes a function of information. I mean, because then you'll be talking in terms of degrees of resolution, right, which would be a function of, so visibility itself becomes a function of information rather than the other way around. Namely that you get information from what you see, right? So you have this other step now. It's how you get information from what you see. Visibility, what you see is itself a function of information. And of course, this has huge theoretical and political implications. I mean, this is really one of the things, for example, I think also behind Vicky's presentation, when you talk about, you know, assemblages and sutures and showing us these images and how they might relate to church fronts and so on and so forth. Right? I mean, there's a kind of connection between them that's not clear. And so it's a kind of politics which it's no longer a politics of the spectacle, right? But the politics of the spectacle in a very advanced stage. You know, I mean, it's not the debut of the Society of the Spectacle of 1968. It's a debut of the Society of Notes on the Society of the Spectacle of 1988, where the spectacle is now information. Right?
Thank you. That's a great comment. I just want to build on that because I think it's exactly correct, and I almost feel it goes even beyond that of what's visible, but it's actually what's able to be processed, which adds a whole other dimension to it politically because of the people that make the framework and structure within which you're able to process these things. And that's what I think is very interesting about this period we're in, because I think people are doing it at one level, and sometimes that's driven by making money, sometimes that's driven by gaining users. We had this conversation. Sometimes all the ways this gets done is driven by many different things. And what we don't quite realize is well, I mean, you guys do because you do the critical theory, but when these systems get created, that's then how we process all of this information. And that's what's very interesting to me at this point, and why this collaboration becomes so interesting. How do we think about cities when cities are now at such a scale that it's not your immediate experience, but it's your mediated experience of a city? So there's two terms that I've been using quite a lot in trying to think about this. One is relational relevance, so the idea of relevance, and the idea of context. And so in thinking about that, trying to create systems that are open enough so that the relevance and the context can be constantly moving and changing. The systems themselves can be moving and changing. The taxonomies, the structure, the framework of all of this information is as fluid as the information itself. So,
it's a sort of terrific opening. I mean, I want to say that, last night I made the comment that, there is a difference between what we see, a certain kind of sameness, really, which has produced the slum, if you like, as a theoretical object that creates a sameness across, let's say, a number of Asian cities, as this sort of site of a certain kind of devastation, a certain kind of replaceability, and it produce, there is this in a way these juxtapositions and these jarring scalar shifts that we saw in Shanghai, or a number of people have spoken about Beijing, Mumbai, Bangkok, Shenzhen, Jakarta. So though the names, Kampung, whatever, Jhopatpatti are different, you get a certain kind of political economy of theory from that resolution, which is undeniable. And at the same time, as an anthropologist, there's this sort of sense that there's a responsibility to the local specificity of those situations. And the scalar question, I think, is very, very important and interesting to open up, because it is one that brings together the kinds of questions that Jane and you are raising in relation to information, and the sorts of questions that sort of scientists are, have to ask themselves today in the face of a certain kind of sameness. And I think this sort of relates to what Ashil and Sarah have been writing about in their work on Johannesburg and South Africa.
Yeah, I just want to, we did come here prepared to talk about ethnography at the urban scale. And so this is a central issue. So the scales are of legibility as well. And it's not just the visual information, it's the sensorium. And remember those three levels I mentioned earlier. There is the material world and sensation, but then there's sensation itself, and then there's the world beyond it. I think the metropolis had a legibility. You went to someone from the colonial center went to the periphery and created a world that was familiar and legible no matter what, kind of capital you went to. And, you did remark when you came to this district of Shanghai some similarities to Mumbai. And we know those codes. When I was the backpacker in Europe, I arrive at a train station, I know where to go. There's the hotel, there's the opera house, it's all there. The megalopolis, American created this information system so we could navigate this new animal of highways and signs and things. And the work of the Eames and things like that, there's incredible, and that's where the field of design begins to emerge and, starts to threaten the field of architecture as the dominant kind of maker of this legible sensorium. Now, I mean, the last model I didn't talk about is the metacity model. So beyond this social hierarchy of the metropolis, megalopolis, megacity, we're working on the metacity model, which is above and beyond these, and they coexist, and it is this world of information, and how we make it legible, how we can inhabit it, and how we can communicate our inhabitation to it, and how we can connect this divide from us in the metropolis. How do we go into the field, and and so I think these tools are important, and leveling the field. I'm not comfortable to bring up Tom Friedman, so, I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Yeah, just before we move on, I just want to add a couple of things sort of coming out of this notion of processing. And just to point out that there are levels of architecture involved in this processing which aren't always visible to us in some sense. I mean, there's the material architecture of the machines that do the processing, and that has a particular kind of architecture. I mean, these things, right? And the handheld device on the one hand, and then there's the programming, the software programming that takes place, and which of course produces a class of important and more influential folks, often very young. I mean, the head of ubiquitous computing at Mozilla, which produces Firefox, is 25 years old, right? I mean, yeah, and so that raises certain kinds of political questions involved. But then the kind of critical language that emerges from that has to do. I mean, you talk about relational relevance, and when you then began to sort of elaborate on relevance, the relational kind of dropped out. So I just want to stress that in bringing it back in, the relational. But the kind of critical language that then gets imported into the set of conversations within the sort of architecture are grids and networks, and it begins to morph into a different kind of critical language that I think we shouldn't lose sight of. Having said that, Carolyn, I'm going to take a few questions at a time, if you can keep them. We don't have all that much time. I'm going to take 3 or 4 at a time so that the panel can sort of comment. First Carolyn, then Gabi. Any other?
I want to ask a really brief question, but I also want to make a comment. The comment is in regard to research design at the intersection of the social sciences and humanities, architecture and arts. And this is for the larger discussion, especially all the graduate students. There is an interdisciplinary research design model that is theoretically framed, empirically based, scaled from local to global, including the body. It's distinctively comparative, both theoretically and empirically. It seeks to raise new questions. It's entirely ethical. It's on the cutting edge, and it's funded by the Social Sciences Research Council in New York, the International Dissertation Research Fellowship. And if you go to that website and you look at the model for that research fellowship, you'll see all these details. And it's difficult to win. It's the most prestigious money available to U.S. and foreign graduate students studying in the U.S. You do not have to be a U.S. citizen to get this fellowship. And 2 years ago, I worked for them for 6 years on this. I was chair of it a couple years ago. And in fact, there were 2 proposals that year that came to the top on slum clearance in India. And they were very different. One, they were differing in quality and emphasis and questions, but the committee thought they were so important because of these kinds of issues that they were both funded. And there was also one targeted at Shanghai to do more or less the same thing, and that one was funded, but of course the research permission was not obtainable, and so the funding had to be rescinded. Anyway, it's a great model. It's already extant. It exists already. Okay. Anyway, I'd be very glad to talk to anyone about it. But on the question, does it matter? It may not. But OMA in Beijing. You mentioned OMA in Beijing in regard to this building, as if that were significant and as if we might know. But if it is significant, we'd like to know more about the role of OMA in Beijing and then doing these projects within the wider Asian region.
Yeah, my remarks are also about the critical language that was floating around. For me, it was very interesting. In earlier sessions, we talked a lot about sustainability, and in that context also about Bateson's ecology of mind. And the terms relational relevance, context, open systems, flexibility, adaptability, and so on are all, in a way, terms that Bateson introduced in his ecology of mind. But this said, I also think that what we are seeing is a very different ecology of mind than the one that Bateson constructed. In the 70s and 80s, Bateson and Luhmann, in a different way, Luhmann's systems theory and then the follow-ups, a lot was still organized around the paradigm of a reduction of complexity. And I think what we see now, I would like to bring it in connection to Ben's introduction of the wicked problems and the discussion we had between Ben and Akbar, where reduction of complexity is no longer possible in the ways in which these theorists envisioned it. It's no longer possible in a situation where we don't know the question or the problem until we have the solution. But then we face something very different, which has to do with information, but also with information overload and with what you addressed at this accelerating and dizzying speed of information. And I think there a new sense of sustainability comes in, and that has epistemological, social, but also mental, psychic, and affective dimensions. How do we mentally and psychically deal with it? I mean, there's all kinds of things. What are the protective barriers we erect in order to defensively not see a problem? And we could even see the economic crisis as something like not wanting to see, because there was too much of the kind of unprocessed information floating around. I mean, it all relates back to what can be processed and how. And I think the session for me was also interesting because it brought together a lot of the strands that have already come up in the discussion, and a kind of, perhaps it's not a theoretical model that's emerging, but the basics of what that theoretical model would have to deal with.
Yeah, this is something I brought up the other day, but I want to bring it up again because of something that Vyjayanthi said, the shift from the discursive to the design thinking. And Ben, you also had mentioned the other day very provocatively, and we didn't get to talk to you about this, the shift from the linguistic turn to the design thinking model. And I bring it up now again also because, Brian, you brought up legibility following on Akbar's visibility. And you also mentioned the word sensorium. So I'm wondering if this turn is not in itself a way of kind of trying to think about more complex models of apprehension and cognition of what we experience. So more phenomenological in a way, but with a critical.
I'm going to start with the OMA just because it's easier, and then we'll work towards what I call the megacity in mental life. OMA, the Delirious New York was obviously, as I mentioned, written by Rem Koolhaas at the founding of OMA, two painters and two architects in the 1970s, at a time where there was not much opportunity for architects, especially creative architects. And because the architecture of the megalopolis is the SOM's HOK, the corporate firm emerged in this period of time. So what you see in OMA Beijing is China provided the opportunity for the Starchitect to act as big as a corporate firm. This is incredible research area. You know, it's something I'm maybe I'll take on someday. I don't know. But what you see is a very surprising turn, following years of columns by Herbert Mouchamp in the New York Times and the MoMA deconstruction show and certain cultural moves to place a few architects at the vanguard, the success of Bilbao as emergist architect, but then, you know, they're beginning to take on this corporate world with a new form of practice, which is collaboratory. I mean, as much as Rem Koolhaas is the star architect, he always says this is Office of the Metropolitan Architect, this is a distributed system, there's all these people who are working and things like that. But of course the media, you know, continually wants to say, oh, he's got 2 wives and, you know, all that sort of stuff. So anyway, that's the short thing. But Vyjayanthi did a little work on CCTV. I don't know if you add, or should we go into the megacity and mental life?
I think we should skip that.
Yeah.
Two things. One to Akbar. If you didn't quite see the connection between the church and the visual assemblages, that's because the visual assemblages, half of the talk I dropped because 10 minutes is 10 minutes. But so you're right to notice the gap. It was really there. But I would like to come back to Gabby's question. It seemed to me to resonate with my own sense of where things are, is that rather than to, well, I don't think that these are mutually exclusive, but for me, rather than to try to rethink theory and retool theory in light of design, my own experience has been to try to open up the process to all the things that have been shut out, I think, from the social sciences and from critical theory and social theory, at least in my experience of them within political science. Not because I don't believe that they're important, but to be led by the object that has not yet been theorized, and then to bring it back to theory. Not that it should remain untheoretical or atheoretical, but there is something about the space for me that has been opened up with design that is different than. I spend most of my life inside the New School going to theory talks. I mean, that is what my entire intellectual life is. And I love them, and I learn a huge amount. They're very stimulating, and so it's not that I don't want to leave it as an opposition between theory and practice at all. I think that that's a false opposition and not one that interests me. I don't want to speak for other people, but I do feel like there's something that I am not going to get from the theoreticians that I speak to that is making me restructure my thinking.
I guess I'll just jump in on this very interesting point that you made, Gabby, and Bhaskar followed up on the notion of ecology. And again, I think that there is a very, very serious scalar issue. I mean, after all, Bateson did work in Bali, and Bali was the sort of laboratory of ethnography for many generations. And I see, the circulation of Bateson's work among architects like Kelly Easterling, for instance, who's done incredible work with inserting that notion of a cognitive ecology into a frame that's really quite different than the one that that Bateson was working with, and that's actually very relevant. I think that there is a sort of gear shift going on, which brings me to this idea of the impossibility of the reduction of complexity, and what that has to do with the notions of sustainability that are driving discourse, very much in Latour's terms as matters of concern, right? Sustainability has become a matter of concern. And it has become a matter of concern because of the density of actors who are congregating around this kind of holy grail for design, as it were. So, you know, Cooper Hewitt in New York has this massive show called Design for the Other 90%, which really sort of goes back to what, you know, the sorts of projects that USAID and the whole kind of development machine supported throughout the Cold War. And many of us were incredibly disappointed with this, this kind of exhibition of work that was, you know, revisiting, it seemed to be revisiting a very old paradigm of intervention, and proposing the idea of sustainability as a kind of a new, you know, interpretation for that practice. And I question that because, you know, who has looked so far into the future that you know, that we will know that these are things that will be forever. And not only that will be forever, but that will be good forever, and that will serve the goals and ends of social justice, which I'm sure we all committed to. And in fact, you know, in our conversations right here in Shanghai, one of the great opportunities has been for the four of us to just sort of sit around and talk about these questions. We really sort of have focused on the idea of time and temporality, and the shift from thinking about a city as a cosmopolis, from imagining it in a temporality of foreverness, right? Which is what these imperial cosmological centers were, where the idea of sustainability cannot be abstracted in the same manner that it can be in an urban situation that is driven by constant change, innovation, or pressure to innovate, and you know, and therefore a pressure to address the ethical dilemmas of design constantly. So for me, that's where the whole question of sustainability sits. That it has become an object of reflection only because of the fact that it is located within a kind of moment of turbulence that calls upon conscious design action.
Okay. The original notion of information from Shannon and Weaver was the reduction of uncertainty. I mean, that was the definition of a bit.
Sorry?
A bit. The interesting thing is that was immediately tied to pattern recognition. Right? It was tied to a cognitive perceptual model, okay, in pattern recognition. And there's a whole stuff on, people follow this from the Gibsons on affordances, which is huge in design theory. I mean, the whole theory of an affordance, it's theory of perception coming out of this model. But for those of you who remember, this is a very cognitive model, and there's a turn from the information uncertainty model, which doesn't have risk in it. Shannon and Weaver don't have any risk in their model. There's a long passage, if you look in Merleau-Ponty's Visible and Invisible, where all this material comes back, and it's tied to risk. Okay, so you move from that, and then of course, what you begin to get from this kind of phenomenology of critical phenomenology of affect, if you want to call Merleau-Ponty, is the turn to Heidegger. All right, where anxiety, the parts of Heidegger that Bert Dreyfus doesn't want to read, on anxiety, caring, death. Okay, that whole turn is the turn through the materialization of the body, through the materialization of perception, to introduce the notion of risk. And there are some people, I was thinking of Cameron, Tompkin Wise, a series of young design philosophers, post-Latour for sure, whom people might want to read at some point, who are actually making this huge turn. I mean, it's quite interesting because it draws upon some of the issues that Gabby raised, that you've raised, that Akbar raised. But it's a kind of new critical vocabulary. They talk about, for instance, how, I forgot the word for it the other day, where you're designing things to break with your normal pattern recognition. So they make, if you don't want, they design ashtrays so that your cigarette will roll down into a receptacle rather than burn something. You know, they make light switches to remind you, they're slightly off key, so they remind you to turn out the lights when you leave. This is also very much in the present discussion of what's called nudging. I mean, cognitive perceptual designs that are almost subliminal, but then focus and push you in directions such that the aggregated flow of those directions is huge. So these are things that are talked about for planning social security systems, for pension plans. How do people manage at a micro-practice level to calculate in ways that flow aggregation produce huge social effects, huge social effects. Insurance, the whole rethinking of insurance is along these lines. So it's a very different notion of intervention. That's all I want to introduce. There's a set of areas here where the notion of intervention is very much designing for a little nudge factor that, because of the scale of the intervention in its repetition, creates a new format for whatever's happening. So anyway, that's a whole area that we haven't touched upon, but it's not present in the design discourse in China that I know of. I mean, this is one of the areas where you'd have to push.
No, I mean, it's this notion of the cognitive perceptive. One way of thinking about it would be the whole question of the visible and the legible. Right? And where risk comes in is when the visible is not legible and the legible is not visible. I mean, and this is really the situation of design and architecture in cities. I mean, that's one of them.
Well, can I just sort of follow up on Ben's last comment? There's also this notion, which I think we seem to forget, is there's been this huge shift or transition from precisely the focus of design on artifacts, right? And the production of artifacts to the production of processes such as the ones you are describing, and that are in fact, I think, speculative in the sense of introducing very consciously an uncertainty about outcomes. So that, even if there is a kind of ashtray at the end of the production line, a different kind of ashtray, it's also not just the ashtray, and this speaks to, again, the question of invisibility, right? That it is in fact a social process that is being set into motion. I think a lot of designers are grappling with the sort of notion, the place of speculative design or the place of speculation in design, and bringing that to the front and center of the process. So,
yeah, I think it's something, as an architect, I think about a lot, especially with Benjamin's architecture is perceived in a state of distraction, and so when you're not designing an object, a rarefied object, or the painting on the wall in the gallery, the erratic, but you're designing an environment that is perceived in a distracted way over time, and that goes back to some of the ideas of time and nature that Victoria was talking about, and I think you want to follow up on.
Well, I don't know if I can yeah, this is a sidebar for Victoria in a conversation we had earlier. We talked a lot about relationality, sustainability, and ecology. And I taught with Cameron last year, and a lot of fun to teach with him, really great. But there is also a kind of a normative certainty that makes me extremely uncomfortable in a way that re-echoes the conversation last night. And so I want to end with the question of the politics. Cameron is very sure we should always press the small button on the toilet, and that we ought to design the world to make sure that that happens. And I worry about the sustainability, ecology. The course was called Visual Ecologies, and I'm like, already I'm freaked out. I'm in this ecological. All of my work is about unsmoothing. I want to make anything that seems smooth and ethically clear, unclear. So that for me would be the visual assemblages. What is the visual doing in terms of the normative position, and how can we stage those things and make them visible as a politics and not just a design?
Yeah. And just to reiterate just the designer as a maker and a doer and a engager in an environment, and this interplay with theory is just incredibly interesting, just in the sense that it's to address the question I think that was asked was really interesting of how do we mentally and psychically deal with all of this, and I think part of that is through making things. So, and I think that this iterative, God, we screw up all the time. Boy, we made a mess of that. Boy, that was bad. Yeah. And I think that's part of the beauty of it. So that's just my last comment.
Two things. First, a round of applause for a rich conversation this morning.